My name is Leslie Thompson. I am a settler and guest on the lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and I am joining you this evening in my role as Director of Adult Programs here at the Sid Richardson Museum. And tonight, in honor of our current exhibition, Remington, Russell in Black and White, our very own director, Scott Winterrowd, is going to present tonight's lecture exploring the illustration careers of Remington and Russell. Who were the leading artists who captured the passing of the Old West and really helped to popularize it through works made in grayscale, specifically for reproduction in books and magazines. So tonight's talk will cover different paths that both artists took in illustration, centering each of them within their own circle of artists who were working during the period that we now know today as the Golden Age of illustration. For those who are not familiar with Scott, he is our director here at the Sid Richardson Museum, a position that he has held since July of 2019. Prior to coming to the Sid, Scott has worked for many major art museums, including the Amon Carter Museum, the Dallas Museum of Art, the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And most recently, he served as Director of Education at the Meadows Museum at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Scott has developed an array of multidisciplinary educational materials on a wide range of art topics covering both Western and non-Western art history. He has also developed interpretive materials and assisted in planning exhibitions focused on major artists, including Francisco Goya, Pablo Picasso, Thomas Eakins, Thomas Moran, and Frederic Edwin Church. Scott has been active in the art museum education field, serving as program chair for the Board of Museum Education Roundtable from 2003 to 2009. In 2014, he was awarded Art Museum Educator of the Year for the Western Division of the National Art Education Association. And Scott holds a master's degree in art education and a certificate in art museum education from the University of North Texas. And Scott, who is a native of Fort Worth here, he's also an artist who focuses on watercolor and print media, drawing his subject matter from his travels and landscapes of the Southwest and his native Texas. And I like to bring this up and mention this because I think that his artist lens, in addition to his background as an educator, really helps to lend itself to his readings of Remington and Russell's works, which you'll get to experience tonight in our lecture. So, and of course, Scott is the curator of our current exhibition, Remington and Russell in Black and White, which is the focus for tonight's talk. So with that, please join me in welcoming Scott Winterrowd.
Where should I do this?
Just put it up on you.
Is that good? Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much, Leslie. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's so nice to see everyone. And a lot of you are very familiar faces. And I'm so glad to have you back at the museum to talk a little bit about our current exhibition. And I'm excited to share this with you, that the current exhibition in this kind of storyline that runs through the show, that'll be a little kind of clearer than what you see in the installation, which is not, we didn't do anything chronological with the installation. We realized people don't really follow chronology, so why do it? And there are some things that happen in the installation. If you're interested in knowing a little bit about that, I could talk about it after we're finished if you want to go out in the galleries. But tonight, primarily, as Leslie mentioned, I'm going to kind of track both artists and their career in illustration. Excuse me. And before I begin, I'll just say, just in case I drop the word out there, this is such a great opportunity for us to see these works that are made in grisaille, which is the term for grayscale. And so the black and white works were really specifically made to function for reproduction in books and magazines. And so it was very deliberate why they were making these works in grayscale at this particular time to function as part of their illustration careers. And Remington and Russell, as we all know, are really the two that are thought of as the leading painters who established the genre of the Old West in painting and sculpture. And really supposedly before it passed, but the reality for Remington and Russell is they both don't arrive into the West until 1880 or 1881. And at that point, the West is pretty much settled. The cattle drives were on the wane. The Pony Express had been long over since 1861. And then the Transcontinental Railroad, of course, by 1869 shuts down the old stage lines, although some still existed until the turn of the century. The last of the big cattle roundups have already taken place, and they're kind of on the wane as well. And so by the time they get out to the West is essentially over. And so they really, I think, see a glimpse of what the Old West was, and then really capture that and reimagine that in their careers and do it to great effect. The two artists also, let me just put them together. We like to kind of clarify why we hang Remington and Russell side by side in all of these museums, these Western art museums. And it's really because of their stature at this early period of the Western genre, and not really because they knew each other, not because they are anything alike. They grew up in very different spheres. And Remington, of course, as you know, was born and raised in New York, and he died only 4 miles away from the border of New York and Connecticut. His career was centered in the art and publishing capital of the United States in his time, while Russell, originally from St. Louis, moved to Montana just shy the age of 16, and with the exception of the 6 winters at the end of his life that he spent in Los Angeles or Southern California, he never lived anywhere else. He died in Great Falls in October of 1926. The two artists are close in age. Remington was born in 1861 and Russell in 1864. And Remington's career really took off early due to his location in New York, in the center of the publishing world. Russell's career in illustration really wouldn't take off until close to the end of Remington's life, which Remington was cut short, of course, at the age of 49 in 1909. And so I'm going to go ahead and begin and talk just a bit about Remington and his early career. But just to remind everybody of Remington's story, I've established him as a New Yorker. He was fascinated by the West, and so he travels out to Montana in 1881. And on that trip, he did visit the site of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or the Battle of the Greasy Grass. He goes back east for a time and then decides he's going to try a venture in 1883 as a sheep farmer in Peabody, Kansas. And this was financed by his inheritance, but he wasn't really successful at it, and it lasts less than a year. In 1884, Remington moves to Kansas City, and he becomes a part owner. He's in a partnership with a hardware store, and he then goes back east and he proposes to his sweetheart, Eva Catton, and they plan to be married in October of 1884. And so he goes back. The hardware situation falls apart really rapidly. He loses a lot of money, and then he gets into a joint partnership in a saloon. And then he brings Eva back out to Missouri and fails to tell her what's really going on, and pretends he's going off to work at a hardware store every day. And what he's really doing is going to the saloon and drawing and sketching. He's already fascinated by making art. He's painting already at this time. So he's already got the bug for making the art, but he hasn't figured out how he's going to make things work. And when she figures out what's going on, she packs up, leaves, and goes back to her parents in the East. So, of course, he immediately runs after her. Gets to her and basically says, this is not going to work out unless you figure out a job. So in a sense, she kind of forces him to make a decision about what he's going to do. And so in 1885, in the fall, Remington schedules a meeting. He's already had one illustration put into Harper's Weekly, but he goes, sets up a meeting where he thinks he's meeting with the fine arts editor at Harper's, and instead he's actually meeting with Henry Harper himself. He dresses up in Western gear as if he's a rugged outdoorsman. You know, he's just got back from Kansas, why not? And sells himself as a Westerner and shows off sketches that he has made while he's been out in the West, and he's immediately hired as a staff artist for Harper's. And so these early works that Remington was doing were basically works that are situated around the Indian Wars, and in particular, of course, the Geronimo campaign. And this drawing on the left on the screen is one of the earliest drawings we have in the collection here at the Sid Richardson Museum. And you can see kind of the rough nature of this drawing. It's not very fleshed out. It's not as highly finished as Remington's work will become later. So this is the kind of work that really caught the attention of Harper's. And I think it was really the action that they were so excited about in these works. Even though there isn't a lot going on, there's not a lot of artistic ability at this point. It's really the movement in the piece. And it's just good to know that Remington's work wasn't considered good enough to just immediately publish the way it was. So they would actually hire a staff artist to recreate Remington's images for the publication. And so this is an 1886 sketch, of course, but what we have over here is the 1889 actual cover for Harper's that featured the ambush picket that was redone by another staff artist. So it's interesting to see this in these early days of Remington's work. And I just totally didn't talk about this, did I? I just wanted to make a quick mention about another early illustration, another 1886 published illustration. The Apaches Are Coming that Remington created. And so you can really see a bit of the clunky nature of the figures. There's an awkwardness to some of this. I just want you to get a sense of what his work was like in this early period. And also the fact that Remington, of course, is always going to revisit these subjects that he's created over his career. So we have this 1886 print paired with our 1904, the Apaches. And you can see the similarity in what's happening in the storyline of these two, but you also can see a totally different kind of stripped down approach to this really large yellow expanse that we have our much later painting. Sorry about that. I like to get ahead of myself every once in a while when these talks. And another really wonderful work that we have in the show, and I think a work that shows the kind of sophistication that Remington gets to very rapidly. So we're talking, he's in 1886 having these kind of more crude sketches. By the time we get to 1889, he's much more adept at his figure handling, and there's much more, I think, a naturalism to the horses. He's kind of adapted more of the movement and the horses flying through the air, which is a signature kind of Remington feature that he borrows from the photographs of Edward Muybridge, although he likes to play that down as much as possible. But a fun aspect of what we have in the exhibition is this wood engraving block that was actually the block that was used by the magazine to print the images in the magazine. And this is a fascinating object. It's made up of a number of smaller blocks that were broken up. So that what would happen is Remington would create a painting, and it was actually a 26 by 40-inch oil painting that was then scaled down and then reversed and then placed on the block. And then the block is divided up from different artists so that the work would go faster. And then once the carving is all done, the block is rejoined, and then an artist would come back in and touch it all up, make sure everything fit together and looked right, and then it would be ready for printing. So I really like to talk about this process because it's really fascinating in the sense that it's handmade, mass-produced, and it's kind of interesting in that respect, and it produces these really wonderful, very clean images for the magazine in that time period. And also, just to reinforce this, these two images are not in the exhibit, but I just thought it would be a good idea to see an 1886 oil by Remington, a flag truce in the Indian Wars on the left, next to a painting from 1889. And I'm always astonished at this painting, Dash for the Timber, which of course is here in Fort Worth. It's one of Remington's great masterworks. But it is just such a terrific example of his art, and he's very young, and he's really just kind of figuring it out. And what happened was, after he started with the paper, he knew he needed to brush up on his painting skills, and so he enrolled in the Art Students League. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that aspect of his work because that brought him into the orbit of a lot of other artists. And one of the things I've really learned about working with Remington so closely these past 5.5 years, and then at my past work at the Carter, Remington really was always looking at other artists and adapting and learning from what he was seeing. And I just wanted to mention Remington's kind of circle talk. And one of the artists that he went to Art Students League with was Charles Dana Gibson. And so just like Remington is going to be known for his Western subject matter, Gibson, of course, is known for these very elegant lady, the Gibson girls, that are very much associated with kind of cosmopolitan New York of that time. Another artist that he knew and ran in the same circles with is Howard Pyle. And Howard Pyle, of course, has his own kind of signature subject, pirates. And so pirates are very near and dear to Pyle's work. And Pyle was also a very influential teacher to a number of other illustrators. And Pyle was friends with Remington, and we have in this installation, in the part of the permanent collection that's on view, our painting, The Puncher, it's on the right over here, is a painting that Remington offered as trade for getting the painting that you see on the left. Now, this is the reproduction from Harper's. I haven't been able to find a good image of the original painting, but it exists somewhere still, as far as I can tell. But it's a painting that it's titled "Pirates Used to Do That to Their Captains Now and Then." Kind of gruesome image, but Remington saw this and he wrote to Pyle immediately. He said, "I have to have this painting of a pirate, and I'll trade you anything you want," basically. And so the trade came out, and The Puncher is the painting that went to Pyle, and you can see that it's signed to him, to my friend H. Pyle, down here in the lower left. And another artist that we might not think of as an illustrator, but he did do illustration work early in his career, is Childe Hassam. And I bring Hassam in because he was a very close friend of Remington to the end of his life. And Hassam is most closely associated, of course, as an American Impressionist painter. And I brought in one image of his work in that vein on the left. But he also did black and white illustration in his career. So he was known for doing this kind of illustration and crossing over. And I just think it's interesting to think about that kind of camaraderie among illustrators, because there was a very much a hierarchy between illustration and fine artist. And so Hassam really straddles the line, and I think Remington, of course, is wanting to straddle the line in his later career, and I'll mention that in just a moment. But like I said, the focus here is primarily on Remington as illustrator tonight. And I did bring this particular Hassam on into the program just because it's also a nocturne, which is a signature subject, of course, Remington takes on. I brought in for the exhibition one of our paintings in the collection, which is in a stiff current. And I just wanted to bring it because, again, Remington is creating these very large-scale oils. They're about 27 by 41 inches. And he's painting these oils that will be then reproduced at about 5 by 7 inches in the smaller magazines. So it's kind of interesting in that respect that he works on the scale that he does, and that it shrinks to the size that it is in these particular illustrations that are published. And this is the way the public, of course, would have received these kind of images. And this particular painting was an illustration for Julian Ralph's article, Talking Musquash, which centered around the Canadian fur trade. Musquash is actually referring to muskrat pelts. And so this is a real story about the Hudson's Bay Company and the voyageurs in the north. This next it's a letter that we have in the collection, and it's to Fred Shell. And Shell was actually the art editor for Harper's. And I found this really fun in relation to this exhibition because it's a letter where Remington is talking to him about how he sees the layout for a particular article going. So you can see over in the letter that he's kind of laid out the images as he sees them on a double-page spread. And then this is a letter that's actually written in 1890, but a number of months later is whenever the actual article is published. And so you can see how that changed as the article went along in its production. And this is a kind of a fun side note is the article itself. Its title is The Last of the Buffalo, and it focuses on the man that you see up here. This is C.J. Buffalo Jones, and he's referenced in the letter. He came by to visit Remington, and Remington drew his sketch, and he's even kind of put him in the drawing over there. It's kind of funny. And I love his little caricature of Buffalo Jones, who is quite a distinctive character here with that beard. But C.J. Buffalo Jones is an interesting character because he was a buffalo hunter who claimed to have killed thousands of bison, but he later turns to be a conservationist. And he began, after he had killed so many bisons, he begins to collect bison and start his own herd. And in the late 1880s, he actually tried to crossbreed the buffalo with cattle in hopes of creating a sturdier breed that could survive the winters on the northern plains. And he called them Catalo, and we have a Catalo down here. But unfortunately, the Catalo couldn't actually breed, and so it wasn't a successful venture for him, and later he lost the money and had to sell the herd off. But he comes back again and becomes even more of a conservationist as he is called on in 1902 to be the first game warden at Yellowstone National Park and protect the bison herd that's there. And interestingly enough, for this exhibition, we were able to get access to this drawing in a private collection, which is also an article that relates to the bison. Policing the Yellowstone is an article that Remington wrote and illustrated, and he's going out with the 6th Cavalry in this article, and he's out with them navigating the difficult terrain. And actually 4 of the 7 illustrations in this article are dedicated to seeing people going up and down mountains and picking their way over logs. And it's just truly a beautiful image. I love the ink wash and the ragged edge of this to give us a sense of the forest and the broken trees along this very steep incline, and these poor pack mules that are trying to bounce their way over logs as they hop along. But it's a really interesting article in respect to the fact that they're actually out looking for the bison in the park, and they're not very successful. They said, the article says they found 1 and they found spore, so they knew they were around. But at that time, there were about 400 bison left in the park, and by 1900, there were only about 25 left of the herd in the park, because poaching was so bad and it was so hard to police, and it wasn't made illegal really until, though I think, I don't have the date in my head, but it's much later in the decade right before the turn of the century. My favorite thing about this article and just seeing these together is noting that the illustration itself, how it plays a role in really kind of making a dynamic composition across the page, the way it cuts in and out of the words, the text on the page. It creates a very interesting kind of almost cross pattern across. And one of the fun things in this particular article that I found really amusing when I first read it, it's actually one of the more readable articles from this time. They're kind of stilted, kind of awkward sometimes, and this one's quite fun. But he got to Yellowstone and he went to the Golden Gate to see the view, and he just was astonished that nobody was really paying any attention to the view. All they were standing there doing was clacking away with their cameras. And then he makes this comment and he says, nobody can come equal to the view. He said, Thomas Moran tried and he did pretty good, but it's kind of cute. But I think it's just fascinating to hear Remington talking about photography being so annoying in the national park in the 1890s. Remington's always looking for that Old West feeling, and I'm sure he wasn't wild about the cameras clacking away. Another illustration we got access to, and it's a super fun image, is jumping onto a horse, where you see this buffalo soldier who is flying midair and about to land on this horse that does not look any too happy about what's about to happen. It's from an article that Remington wrote whenever he traveled out to Nebraska, The Essentials at Fort Adobe. And as I first started reading this, I was like, what is Fort Adobe? Because it's a very odd article, and it seems to kind of talk around itself the whole time. But Fort Adobe is Fort Robinson, and there were actually Adobe barracks at Fort Robinson. And at that time, when he was out there, the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed there. And really, the article, it's pretty boring. It's talking about the mundane life of drills and just the boring life at camp. And then it's all of a sudden interrupted by what he calls horse gymnastics, and that's what you're seeing in these illustrations. And this, of course, our super fun image here that you see up at the top, but this guy standing on his head, and then this guy over here that I've never really figured out exactly what he's doing, rubbing the horse's belly, I'm not sure. But it's quite a funny little article and a fascinating group of works by Remington. This painting is quite fascinating because it takes a departure. Everything we've seen up till now was accompanying some sort of article. And for some reason, Remington painted this painting around 1897, and there is no accompanying story for this particular painting. So lots of questions. Why did he choose to paint it in grisaille? He could have gone color. I mean, it's a pretty grim scene, so maybe that was what he was going for, to mask some of the blood, although he didn't shy away from blood in any way, so I don't really buy that as I say it. But it's a really fascinating picture, and it was included in a book called Drawings. There was a number of sketches, around 60 works that were included in this book called Drawings, even though this is an oil painting. There's even a bronze in the book called Drawings. It was also included and circulated as a poster that you could buy in addition to the deluxe edition of the book. So it was a widely known and widely circulated image. And the image's popularity is really quite fascinating. And this is my plug for the next exhibition, which is that we're doing a show that'll open in May. It's going to be called The Cinematic West, the Art That Made the Movies, because this particular painting was used in a 1918 film by John Ford, starring Harry Carey, excuse me. And the painting is actually at the very beginning. It plays a cameo and it turns to life. So there's actually a tableau that starts out the film. And the painting at that point probably was purchased by Douglas Fairbanks and was in his collection until his death in 1939. After his passing, his third wife kept it until 1953 when she sold it to movie producer Hal Wallace. Hal Wallace at the time was working on Gunfight at OK Corral, and he collected a number of Remingtons in the 1950s and then included this painting as a cameo in a Dean Martin, Shirley MacLaine film in 1961. So it's kind of a fascinating centerpiece of looking at Remington and Russell and other Western artists' paintings in relation to the influence that they had on Western movies in the 20th century and that kind of legacy that comes down to us even in Westerns in the 21st century. So hope you'll come back and see that. This next image is an illustration for a story. It was a story written by Stephen Crane, and it was published in Century Magazine. The title of the story is A Man and Some Others. And Crane at the time had been spending time in Texas and around San Antonio and South Texas. And then he also spent some time in northern Mexico, excuse me. And I really love this painting by Remington. It's a very evocative scene of the what is conjured up in Crane's writing. And I'll just give you this quick quote from the story. It says, "Dark mesquite spread from horizon to horizon. There was no house or horseman from which a mind could evolve a city or crowd. The world was declared to be a desert and unpeopled." And I just think it's really kind of wonderful because he gives you this wonderful feel of this mesquite plain in this painting by not painting very much in the painting. It's very loose, impressionistic, very wispy, and it's just really fascinating how he communicates the setting in this particular work. And the story, just to give you a brief synopsis, is centered around this sheep herder that you see here, Bill, who has run into trouble with a group of Mexican sheep herders that were already in that territory, and it doesn't go well in the end. And this is the moment where there's a confrontation while Bill is making breakfast. He's holding up his frying pan here, and he's looking around with surprise at this apparition in the mesquite, and he calls out, "Hello, Jose, what's the matter?" Hence the title of the painting, Hello, Jose. So it's quite a fascinating work. And to say just a tiny bit more about that, I just wanted to give you a couple of details. The one on the left is from Hello, Jose, and the one on the right is from Days on the Range, Hands Up, which we'll see in a minute. But I just wanted to point out just how thinly painted. You can really see the canvas weave, the color of the canvas showing through, which gives these works that warm, kind of creamy tone that we have to the yellowy brown. There's not really a pure black and white. And that's one reason we struggled with the color of the walls of the exhibition. We didn't want to be black and white about it because the works are very warm in most cases. And so that's why we went with that very, very dark brown. But you can also see the same thing here where you see passages of the canvas showing through in this sagebrush that he's very hastily and very kind of blotted in with the brush in this area. So just, again, the rapidity and then the reserve of the way that he's painting, I've really come to find it informs kind of his later, more impressionistic work that he creates after the turn of the 20th century, after 1900. Another work where you can see that same kind of treatment actually in the sagebrush along the side of the hill here is this super fun painting. It's always been one of my favorites over at the Amon Carter, and they were very nice to allow us to borrow it. It's The Ride of the Road, a hazardous encounter on a Rocky Mountain trail. And this was painted after Remington visited Colorado. And it's interesting to me because in this particular painting, Remington shows us this stagecoach that's being spooked, and the team of horses is being spooked by the bicycle that's coming by them. And it's fascinating because Remington complained on that trip that when he got out to the West, it was all bricks and overalls and derby hats, and it wasn't his Western trade. So he's really complaining about the modernization that he's seeing in Colorado at that time. And then he comes back and he paints a very modern fad, the bicycle, which he also was an avid rider of the bicycle himself. So it's kind of a humorous take for him. I also just want to point out that it's one of those instances where Remington is revisiting a composition to some degree, where he's taken from Right of the Road on the left and reimagined that as a nocturne in 1906 in our wonderful painting Taint on the Wind in the collection here, where he's now, instead of giving us what's spooking the horses, he's leaving it open to mystery because it's out of sight in the dark. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to see Remington and the way that he can rethink these images in his work, and so successfully. Another painting that was made on that same trip is the mule pack that you see here. And sorry. This is a work that was really important in respect to that, because it's actually Remington's last painting that he created for Harper's Weekly. He had a contract with them that lasted about 15 years. That ended in 1901, and that's kind of about the time he starts to shift to working with Collier's magazine. And his Collier's contract will come up really in 1903, and those will be for color works, double-page color works. And this work, as we were saying earlier about the misdeal, was not a work that was used as an illustration for a specific article. There was an article about ice rescues in this magazine, but it has really nothing to do with the subject matter here. But talking again more about Remington and the way he's painting in this time period, the kind of beauty of this painting is its abstract qualities, and just that white expanse of the snowfield on the Rockies, and these very abstract shapes, these kind of strange geometric looking blobs of gray. It's just really a striking composition, and really kind of fascinating, and I think, again, leading towards the kind of work that he'll create as he becomes more associated with Impressionism. And then our painting, of course, the Cowpuncher, which is such a great example of Remington's work, and really showing how Remington is thinking about these compositions and how they're going to work with the masthead on the magazine. So he's left all of this space up here open so we can see that, and then also left it open over on the side, even so that Whistler's Wister's poem can be read. And of course, I forgot to write that down on my paper, so I'm going to have to read it up here. So Wister wrote this poem for the painting, which is, of course, a reversal from the way most illustration works would have happened, because it's normally you're taking from a story and creating your illustration. Here's the poem. No more he rides yon waif of might. He was the song the eagle sings. Strong as the eagle his delight, for like his rope, his heart had wings. And finally, this is for Wolfville Days. This is a Remington painting that was done, does the only illustration. He had done illustration work for the book Wolfville a number of years earlier and did a number of illustrations for that. With this one, he only did the frontispiece. So at this point in Remington's career, he's starting to dial down how much illustration work he's doing, because he's really trying to transition away from being known as an illustrator to being known as a fine artist. And I think it's also important to note, remember the beauty of the wood engraving of Cowboys Coming to Town for Christmas earlier. Now, at the turn of the century, we have these photo mechanical reproductions that are just not of the same quality as what you were getting earlier on when chromolithography or the wood engravings were being made for these magazines, although chromolithography was more expensive and more time consuming. But I mean, I'm just saying there is almost artistry to the reproductive processes in the 19th century as opposed to what we get once we go to a duotone process that we see here. And I just wanted to make the point again, as we're ending with this, we were looking back just to kind of remember, by 1904, Remington stops. I mean, he paints some black and white images in 1904 for illustration, but by 1905, there's no more in his catalog. And so he really dials back doing black and white illustration as he's in that last 4 years of his life, trying to recast his career as a fine art painter. And I think that's kind of fascinating to look at in relation to his work, that he's really dialing it back and moving so much more towards these really pastel, amazing array of color canvases, such as our Buffalo Runners Bighorn Basin from 1909. And with that, we will turn to Charles Russell's career. And this is Russell's earliest illustration that he submitted to Harper's Weekly. And it may be that he saw Remington's work in the magazine and was kind of compelled to see if he could get a work in the magazine, and it was accepted. And it's a very grim scene. It shows this kind of early realism that won't be part of Russell's later kind of more romanticized view of the West. But a very grim scene in which two cowpunchers have come upon a group of Native Americans who have recently killed a cow. And really what it's showing is that they've been pushed to do this because the federal government has not been providing the proper provisions for the reservations. And the accompanying caption for this talked about this. I think it's really interesting to see this because in this instance, just as throughout his career, Russell's sympathies are certainly with the indigenous people that we see in the work. So this is his earliest illustration that he got published. Russell wasn't really motivated to get out there and sell the work so much. He was really just interested in making paintings and drawings all the time when he's a night herder, and he's just constantly making art with whatever he can get his hands on. We know he's already making little wax sculptures and things of that nature, but he's just constantly working. And so really the motivation for Russell to create works that are going to be reproduced or published comes from other people. And so he's actually approached by a friend of his, Ben Roberts, who was really a saddle maker, but Roberts had gotten a hold of a very famous early work of Russell's, Waiting for a Chinook, which is a scene in a blizzard of a starving, freezing cow. And he turned that into a postcard. So he starts peddling these, finding ways to make money off of them. And then he approaches Russell and he says, I think you should make a series of images that we could publish in a book. And so he does this and he creates a number of images. This is one of them over here on the left. Studies of Western Life was that book from 1890. So it's a very early publication for Russell. And I just brought this particular image in because I've paired it in the exhibition on the label. So you can see how he's used this composition in 1890 and returned again to this same composition in 1896. So again, how he's constantly, both Remington and Russell are constantly borrowing from themselves. This oil is an interesting find as I was looking at this. And I should say, as I back up and make sure and clarify, this is an oil painting as well. The paintings that were done for this were oils. And he's trying to figure out how grisaille works in these paintings. But this is an early Russell as well from 1894. And again, a situation where somebody saw Russell's work, found out about him, approached him to see if he would illustrate a book for them. And in this case, it's a man named John Beacom. And he commissioned Russell for this project to create 8 illustrations, 1 oil that you see here, and 7 watercolors for his 1894 book, How the Buffalo Lost His Crown. And the story is a tale that Beacom is recounting that he had heard from an old Blackfeet man named Nisakayo. And that's what we see in the image here. We've got Nisakayo telling his story over here while Beacom sits and listens. So it's this wonderful night campfire scene. And it really tells about how the buffalo, who for centuries had been chief among the animals and people of the earth, had become cruel and had lost his place as chief to the Indian thanks to the tiny mouse. That's just a quick synopsis. But the story also really mirrors the demise of the bison on the Great Plains and recounts how the Blackfeet Nation, who had held control over the vast territory of the plains, saw it lost before the pitiless advance of another race. So it's a really interesting book in the respect that it's an army officer who's actually talking about the movement of the indigenous people onto reservation lands and how their livelihood was lost with the bison. It's very condemning, and I think it's an interesting early publication in that respect. As I look at this, it's a smaller oil. And one of the things that was interesting to me as I started looking into Russell's work in illustration was that he didn't paint very many oils in black and white. He was a much more adept at watercolor, and he did a lot of watercolor and gouache drawings or paintings on paper, and then later would do pen and ink sketches because it was much more expedient for him. But he only made around 30 black and white oils that I've been able to identify. And I just also wanted to say too, how a scene like this where you're sitting around the campfire listening to stories is always a way I've kind of interpreted the painting in the Sid Richardson collection here, Grub Pile, which seems like a moment after the meal where they're having a smoke and talking and listening to stories, and this kind of idea of where authenticity comes from in terms of telling these stories for Russell, or in this case for John Beacom. And I also wanted to bring in this illustration from Harper's by Remington, that's troopers singing the Indian medicine song. So you can see where Russell might have seen this illustration in the magazine and been inspired for making An Evening with Old Nisakayo. And the next illustration is made in the year following when Russell meets and marries Nancy Russell. And if I know you all probably know stories about Nancy Russell and how she really kind of took over the management of Russell as an artist. And so I think it's really interesting to look at this particular painting, because this was a painting that came about because a man named William Cameron came through to Butte, Montana, and he was staying in a hotel there and he happened upon Russell's paintings hanging on the walls. And so he inquired about who this man was, and then he was told to go find Russell in Cascade. And so he approaches him, sees his work, and offers him a large contract to make paintings for Western Field and Stream magazine, which of course is about to become just Field and Stream magazine at the time. And this composition is one of those early paintings. His original contract called for 20 paintings and 20 pen and ink drawings, but shortly after Cameron returned to New York, he quit the magazine and much of the original contract evaporated, but some of the paintings did come through. And I just wanted to make sure and point out that Russell for this project was getting $15 per painting. And what Cameron was really trying to sell him on was exposure. He got $50 for the 20 pen and ink sketches. And you know, Nancy, I think, sees this and sees how her new husband is doing business. And I think she starts to see how she could manage this better than him. And so I think at this point in their early relationship, she begins to take over the business side of Russell's art. And I really wanted this picture to come because it's fascinating, because it's so similar in composition to our painting of Captain William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition meeting with the Indians of the Northwest. It's quite a title. A lot of these paintings have these long titles, but it's a kind of an odd composition because it's just got Clark in it with his slave York next to him, and we don't see Lewis in the picture. And there's been speculation about this. Russell's father actually did write him around this time and said, the family of William Clark want a painting by you. And so the speculation has been maybe he favored Clark in this picture as a way to sell the picture to them, but there's no way to fully know. The interesting thing about these two pictures is the figure group is very similar. We can see Charbonneau over here. We see Clark again pretty much as he is in the painting, and then instead of York standing next to him, we now have Lewis in the picture, and York has been put just behind him. So it's great, fascinating in that respect. The other thing is that it's not exactly accurate in terms of what we're seeing here, because originally the title of this painting was Lewis and Clark Meeting the Mandans. And Mandans don't live in teepees. And then in this picture, I almost think this picture might have come after this picture, because in this one, he adds in a bull boat in the foreground, which is accurate for the Mandans, but still in the distance over in the far distance over there, you'll see there's still teepees. So it's interesting in that respect that Russell's trying to kind of figure out his stories as he's painting these things in this early period. Another painting that was made as part of that Western Field and Stream project was this one, Before the White Man Came, which is a subject Russell returns to again and again in his body of work. And it's a beautiful painting. I love to have it here. It's great. As I love the crazy abundance of wildlife that they're watching up here as they begin to ready for the hunt. And the skeleton in the foreground with the missing horn over here is quite nice as well. So it's a wonderful work from this early period of illustration in Russell's work. After 1903, after the Christmas of 1903, the Russells traveled to New York City for the first time. And the purpose of this trip was to show off Russell's work and to meet publishers to secure contracts for illustration work. And so while Nancy worked on the business end while they were in New York City, and they were in New York like from December into March, Russell spent time sharing a studio with the artist John Marchand. And I just wanted to bring these in just so you saw some of the other illustrators that Russell was exposed to and worked with at that time. And there's a lot of talk. If you look at Russell's work, you know, he's a self-taught artist. He gets gradually better throughout the 1890s and becomes much more sophisticated in his work with watercolor before he really figures out oil and colors in oil. I think by 1901, 1902, he's become a much more sophisticated painter. And really, they say after this trip to New York, you know, his color really kind of comes into play. And so it's one of those things that's really important to think about the influence of other artists that he meets. So he shared a studio with John Marchand. And so we would have been exposed to Marchand's black and white images for illustration. And then another artist that was in that same studio was Will Crawford. And I really enjoyed these because they're political cartoons, but a lot of them have a Western bent to them. And I think they really are reminiscent of the kind of humor that Russell gets in his illustrated letters and other pen and ink drawings. And then another artist to mention who he was good friends with, this is a student of Howard Pyle, Philip Goodwin. And Goodwin was an artist that came out to Montana to meet Russell and spent time with him in Glacier. And actually our subject over here, because Russell, of course, had a cabin in Glacier National Park. And we know Goodwin went and spent time with him there. But again, another artist that's working in black and white to provide for black and white illustration. And the final artist I'll just mention, there's other artists that Russell's talked about that he's influenced by, but I wanted to bring in Thomas Moran just because he's another illustrator artist who was sometimes panned by other artists because he does work in illustration, because that's, you know, the lower end. But I bring this in just because Russell said at the end of his career that he was really influenced by the color palette in Moran's paintings. And it's likely he met Moran whenever he was out in Southern California towards the end of Moran's life and really in the last years of his own life, because Moran settled in Santa Barbara at the end of his life. But these are two early, really wonderful black and white illustrations that Moran created in oils. From that trip to New York, there come a number of commissions that start in for Russell, and this is one that was done for McClure's magazine. It's illustrations for Arizona Nights, and it's two really wonderful images. I love the image of the mule pack coming down the hill in the rain, and just these really sad looking animals in this particular very wet scene. And so the Arizona Nights stories, they're all these stories where they're out on the range and they're traveling, and then they get to their camp spot and they start to tell a story. And this is the story told by Wendy Pete of Immigrant Pass. And there was a really unscrupulous character, Texas Pete, who was holding up a water hole out in Immigrant Pass and charging exorbitant amounts of money for travelers through that area. And this is the moment in the story whenever he gets his, and he's pulled out of the wiki up for holding hostage to this water hole and not providing water to the family that you see coming through here. And this is also shortly after Pete has shot one of their horses. So I love all the details in this. There's so much going on in this really compact little scene. It's wonderful to see the way that Russell's ability in storytelling comes through in these very small works. But I think it really translates to his larger works. He's very much a person, an artist that really can unfold a story across the painting in such a unique kind of way. Another project that Russell gained in 1910 was this particular work, which is from a book by Carrie Adele Strayhorn, 15,000 Miles by Stage. And the book is about her and her husband's travels across the Northwest. Her husband worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, and they were really charting pathways and looking into where the railroad might go. And so they were taking stagecoaches all around. And so in this book, she recounts a number of those stories from that time in her life. And this particular one, he tripped and fell into a den of a mother bear and her cubs, is one of the wonderful images from that we have here in the Sid Richardson collection. The interesting thing that's noted about this illustration is that in the story, it doesn't specify what kind of bear it is, but of course, Russell has spiced it up by making it a grizzly. So it's quite a dangerous scene as we look at it. But the thing that fascinates me about this project for Russell, it's just kind of a huge project. The book itself contained 350 illustrations, 85 of them provided by Russell, 17 watercolors, and 68 pen and ink drawings. And the icing on the cake is that Miss Strayhorn just decided she would show up at Bullhead Lodge for the summer in 1910 and oversee the work. And it really annoyed Russell, and even more so, I think Philip Goodwin was there that year, and she saw him working on a painting somewhere, and I think she said, "Isn't that sweet?" And then Russell just chided him about that for the rest of the summer. So it's quite an interesting story of the patronage that he has. This next illustration in the show is another really fun illustration. I'm so glad we were able to borrow. And Russell entered into a partnership with friends that he had in Montana, Bill Cheeley and Percy Raban, and they were part of the Montana newspaper consortium. And so they initially what they did was they approached Russell to write and illustrate a book, and it was titled Rawhide Rollins Stories. And it proved to be kind of a difficult process because Russell wasn't a big writer, and it took a long time for that to be made. And so scenes like this, though, that you see on the screen were done probably just as inserts for newspapers. And so this humorous little scene stole Jake's gum boots. So his gum boots are these rubber boots that you see here, where he's fooled the hunter who's searching for him down off in the distance, and he can't track him because he can't find any bear prints. And I think it's quite humorous. And I kind of speculate that Jake might be a reference to his old friend Jake Hoover that he had been with when he was quite young and learned a lot about living in Montana and the mountains, who knew the animals out there so well. So I think it's kind of a humorous tongue-in-cheek thing about Jake Hoover. And so the interesting thing too about this drawing is the reverse has an unfinished pen and ink sketch. And it really shows you, I don't think people realize that there's a lot of this pencil underdrawing on these pen and ink sketches. So Russell mapped it out with these rocks and everything in the background, and this bear is coming down from a hill here to get this guy. And this drawing is titled Tracks on the back, but it's really interesting to be able to see that process. I can't see in this reproduction if we can see it in the pencil lines. You can see where he's scratched out. Evidently somebody was on the horseback there, and he's taken that out. So it's interesting to see these little changes that happen. I think there's a scratch out up there as well. Another project that he did with Cheeley and Raban is these drawings that were called Backtrailing on the Old Frontiers. And what they basically decided was, hey, we'll write the story, you just illustrate it, and it'll go much faster. And so they started to do this project with Russell. And so different stories accompanied different illustrations. And I originally, in the first run of the show, we had this drawing up not far away from our painting of the same subject. So our 1917 work is revisited in 1922, and it's just interesting to be able to see the changes, the minor changes that he made between the two compositions. And also, as I said before the White Man Came is a subject Russell returned to many times. So I really love this much later version from 1922, where it's just really the abundance of wildlife on the plains, not even hindered by indigenous hunters in this particular case. Other drawings that we'll have that will rotate through the run of this exhibition, and I'm constantly trying to remember, I think we have Plumber's Men up right now and La Vérendrye, and then these two will be out for the last run, the Mandan Village, where he finally gets the earthen lodges correct in the drawing. and then early early day white buffalo hunters. And then finally, the last drawing in our exhibit, and one made at the very end of Russell's career, roping, which is a beautiful little watercolor. I really love this particular work, kind of a vignette of a roping cowboy. And it was likely intended as an illustration for one of the many projects that Russell was working on in that later period of his life. And it's similar in execution to a group of watercolors that were made to illustrate his own book of stories that would be published shortly after his death in 1927. And it's interesting too, as I started to study this, and nobody had ever really kind of talked about this in relation to our drawing, but even though the horses and riders on either side, the cowboys roping, are different in this watercolor, what they're doing is actually the same thing. So they're actually looping around the steer's hooves, and they're catching him at the top. And this is actually called heading and heeling. And it's allowing the cowboy to stretch the animal on the ground for branding. And so he's laid a trap with one of the ropes and on the ground under the cow's hind feet, while the other cowboy dropped the loop over the head of the heifer. So it's interesting to see how this plays out in these two works that were probably made around the same time period. The work on the right is in Montana Historical Society. It's not in our exhibit, of course, but I just wanted to bring it in for comparison, and also because it's thought to be Russell's very last watercolor. So it's interesting to see these two and to think about our drawing in relation to that. And Russell made illustrations to the very end of his life. So while he was working on these late projects, his health was in decline. And in June of 1926, he and Nancy went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, for Charlie to undergo a thyroidectomy to remove a goiter. While he was there, the operation went extremely well, but the doctors found out that he was suffering not only from the goiter, but from a hernia, and that his lungs were in poor shape. He had emphysema, and he also had an enlarged heart. So it was thought he might have already had a heart attack. And the prognosis was not good. They gave him about a year to live at that point. So after the surgery in late July, they both went to spend the end of the summer at Bullhead Lodge in Glacier National Park. And there, Russell worked on the illustrations for what would be his final project, Trails Plowed Under, a book that would be published after his death. And despite a really terrible summer, so they get up there and there's a horrible wildfire on Lake McDonald, and it's headed straight for Bullhead Lodge, and they're just living in the smoke and the fire. And right at the last minute, the fire turned and went north before it got to where the lodge was. So the lodge thankfully still stands today. But when you're out there in Glacier, you see those old fires and you can see what they've taken out. But Russell still, with all of that going on and declining health, he produced the final 9 of 43 stories for the book, and 14 full-page illustrations and 35 drawings. So really pushing it right up to the end. And upon their return to Great Falls, Russell's health continued to decline. They got back in late September, and he passed away on October 24th of 1926. So, and with that, I will conclude this talk. I know it's kind of a dour note. I apologize for that. But I do hope that you will all go out and spend time with the exhibition and see the real works and see their counterparts in reproduction and have an appreciation for how wonderful these paintings are.